This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome. Today, we step into the ashes of an apocalypse to witness the most transformative million years in Earth's history. We'll journey from the blinding flash of the Chicxulub impact to a world reborn in vibrant, unexpected ways. Discover how life navigated a Strangelove ocean, how tiny mammals underwent a massive growth spurt, and how a legume revolution paved the way for us. This is the story of the first million years after the dinosaurs, a testament to resilience and the chaotic, beautiful dawn of the modern world. Chapter 1: The Day the World Burned and the Fern Spike. The story of the first million years after the dinosaurs does not begin with a slow decline or a predictable shift in the climate. It begins with a single blinding flash of light that fundamentally rewrote the rules of life on Earth in a matter of seconds. Approximately 66 million years ago, an asteroid roughly the size of a mountain, between 6 and 9 miles wide, hurtled through the atmosphere at a speed of 40,000 miles per hour. It struck the shallow waters of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico at a 60-degree angle. This specific trajectory was particularly destructive, as it maximized the ejection of dust, sulfur, and aerosols into the upper atmosphere, ensuring the catastrophe would be global rather than regional. When the asteroid hit, it released energy equivalent to 100 trillion tons of TNT. This was a planetary-scale gunshot that punctured the Earth's crust 12 miles deep and blasted a cavity nearly 100 miles wide. In the immediate vicinity, there was no chance for survival. The heat was so intense that everything within a radius of hundreds of miles was instantly incinerated. The asteroid itself was vaporized upon contact, along with thousands of cubic miles of the Earth's crust. This pulverized rock was launched into the sky as a massive plume of molten material, estimated at 25 trillion metric tons. We know the precise details of this day thanks to a remarkable deathbed site in North Dakota known as Tanis. Here, the fossil record captures the exact hour of the impact. The site contains a jumbled mass of fish, plants, and even dinosaur remains buried by a massive surge of water. Scientists found fossilized sturgeon and paddlefish with impact spherules, tiny glass beads of molten rock called tektites still lodged in their gills. These fish were breathing in the debris falling from the sky even as the water rose to bury them. Analysis of the growth rings in these fish bones reveals that the impact occurred during the Northern Hemisphere's spring. This seasonality explains why the extinction was so lopsided. Many species in the north were in the middle of their most active reproductive cycles, making them far more vulnerable than those in the south, which were entering a period of winter dormancy. As these billions of spherules re-entered the atmosphere across the globe, they acted like microscopic shooting stars. The friction of their re-entry generated a colossal pulse of infrared radiation. For several hours, the entire surface of the planet was bathed in intense heat, turning the atmosphere into a global broiler. This heat pulse ignited dry vegetation across the continents, sparking wildfires in 70% of the world's forests. In places as far away as Argentina, the ground shook with magnitude 11 earthquakes, triggering massive landslides. The primary tsunami, generated by the impact itself, was a wall of water nearly a mile high. In the geological record of Louisiana, scientists have identified buried dunes known as Ghostmaker megaripples, some standing over 50 feet high, which serve as a silent testament to the sheer volume of energy that moved through the seas in the hours following the strike. The fires and waves were only the opening act. The true global killer was the material that remained in the sky. Because the asteroid hit a region rich in the sedimentary minerals gypsum and anhydrite, it injected hundreds of billions of tons of sulfur into the atmosphere. This combined with water vapor to form a dense haze of sulfate aerosols. Alongside the soot from global wildfires and fine dust, these particles formed a suffocating death shroud that blocked out the sun almost entirely. This began the period known as the impact winter. For approximately 1 to 2 years, photosynthesis ceased entirely. On land and in the upper layers of the ocean, the biological engines that power life simply ground to a halt. Without sunlight, plants could not grow, and the food chain collapsed from the bottom up. Temperatures plummeted. In the tropics, where average temperatures had been a balmy 81 degrees Fahrenheit, the mercury dropped to a freezing 41 degrees. This sudden cooling was compounded by the fall of lethal acid rain, which fell for weeks as the atmospheric sulfur washed out, acidifying lakes and the surface of the oceans. The geological signature of this moment is a thin layer of clay found all over the world, known as the KPG boundary. This layer contains a massive iridium spike. Iridium is a metal that is vanishingly rare in the Earth's crust, but common in asteroids. This layer represents the dust that settled out of the atmosphere after the impact winter, marking the exact day the Mesozoic ended. Survival during this time was largely a matter of chance and specific biological traits. Animals that weighed more than 55 pounds were almost entirely wiped out. The non-avian dinosaurs, which had dominated terrestrial ecosystems for over 150 million years, were unable to find shelter or sufficient food. They could not burrow to escape the heat pulse, nor could they hibernate to wait out the long winter. Their high metabolic needs required a constant intake of food that no longer existed. In contrast, the survivors were often generalists. Small mammals survived by living in burrows where the soil acted as an insulator against the surface heat and cold. Freshwater ecosystems also fared better than those on land or in the open ocean. Because these systems rely heavily on detritus, dead organic matter washed in from the land, rather than living plants, the collapse of photosynthesis was not an immediate death sentence. This allowed crocodilians, turtles, and champsosaurs to endure. Champsosaurs in particular were notable freshwater survivors. These crocodile-like reptiles thrived in the post-impact world because their ecosystems were powered by the decaying matter of the old world. When the skies finally began to clear, the world that emerged was unrecognizable. The diverse forests of the late Cretaceous were gone, replaced by a barren, scorched landscape. It is here that we see the global fern spike. In the fossil record of the earliest Paleocene, specifically in the first few thousand years after the impact, the diverse signatures of flowering plants and trees disappear, replaced by an overwhelming abundance of fern spores. In some locations, ferns represent 90 to 100% of the plant life. Ferns are uniquely suited to a world in ruins. Unlike flowering plants, they reproduce via spores that can be carried long distances by the wind and do not require specific pollinators. In the wake of the global fires, the Earth was a vast open field of ash and mud, perfectly prepared for a fern takeover. For approximately 1,000 years, the planet was a monochromatic green. From the high latitudes of Alaska to the islands of New Zealand, these low-growing plants carpeted the earth, stabilizing the soil and beginning the long process of recycling the nutrients locked in the ash. During this first millennium, the climate remained unstable. While the initial impact winter lifted as the dust settled, the massive amounts of carbon dioxide released by the vaporized carbonate rocks and the global fires began to trigger a greenhouse effect. The planet started to swing from extreme cold back toward a period of global warming. The oceans, too, were plunged into a state of biological collapse, as the acidification and lack of sunlight decimated the base of the marine food web. The first few thousand years were a period of intense selection. The organisms that made it through this window were the small, the flexible, and the hardy. As the fern spike reached its peak and began to slowly give way to more complex plant life, the stage was set for the next phase of recovery. The initial trauma of the impact was over, but the long-term work of rebuilding an entire planetary ecosystem was only just beginning. The silence of the fern-covered world was the sound of a planet catching its breath, preparing for an evolutionary explosion that would eventually lead to the rise of the modern world. While the land was slowly turning from ash to green, a different kind of recovery was beginning beneath the waves, where the microscopic survivors were about to undergo a transformation of unprecedented speed. Chapter 2: The Strangelove Ocean and the Mixotrophic Bridge. While the land was undergoing the eerie silence of the fern spike, the world's oceans were grappling with a collapse so profound that it effectively reset the clock on marine evolution. For millions of years, the Cretaceous seas had been defined by their stability and their massive carbonate factories. These were ecosystems where microscopic organisms with calcium carbonate shells were so abundant that their remains, raining down over eons, formed the literal bedrock of the era, the thick layers of chalk that give the Cretaceous its name. But in the immediate aftermath of the Chicxulub impact, these biological engines did not just stall, they were dismantled. As the acid rain described in the previous chapter began to lower the pH of the surface waters, the biological engines of the sea were dismantled. It was a chemical catastrophe that struck at the very heart of the marine food web. Organisms that relied on building shells from calcium carbonate, such as the coccolithophores and the planktonic foraminifera, found themselves living in a medium that was actively dissolving their protective structures. It was as if the very foundations of the marine world were being eaten away. In the first few thousand years, the oceans may have returned to a state dominated by single-celled organisms, a condition the planet had not seen in over 500 million years. The water column, once a complex three-dimensional habitat teeming with life, became a Strangelove ocean, a term used by scientists to describe a sea where the biological pump, the process by which organisms move carbon from the surface to the deep, had completely broken down. Without the rain of organic matter from the surface, the deep ocean was starved of nutrients, and the entire marine system became stagnant and stratified. At the epicenter of this destruction was the Chicxulub crater itself. For a long time, researchers assumed that Ground Zero would remain a biological dead zone for millions of years. The impact had not only vaporized the local environment, but had also created a massive sterile region nearly 100 miles wide. Measurements of the seafloor from this period reveal a haunting vacancy. However, when a scientific mission drilled into the peak ring of the crater in 2016, they found a story that contradicted every expectation of a slow recovery. The rock cores pulled from hundreds of meters below the current seafloor revealed that life returned to the impact site with shocking speed. Within just 30,000 years of the asteroid strike, a diverse community of microscopic life was already thriving within the crater. This discovery suggested that the ocean's resilience was not limited by the proximity to the impact, but rather by the global stabilization of the environment. But even 30,000 years is a long time in human terms. Recent breakthroughs in how we measure time in the geological record have revealed that the recovery started even sooner than that. To understand this, scientists turn to an unlikely clock: space dust. Interplanetary dust falls to Earth at a remarkably constant and predictable rate, and it carries with it a rare isotope known as helium-3. Because this space rain is steady, the concentration of helium-3 in a layer of rock tells scientists exactly how long it took for that layer to form. If a layer is thick but has very little helium-3, it means it was deposited very quickly. If the concentration is high, it means the sediment built up slowly over a long period. By applying this helium-3 yardstick to sites in Europe, North Africa, and the Gulf of Mexico, scientists made a discovery that has been described as ridiculously fast. They found that new species of plankton were evolving in fewer than 2,000 years after the impact. This pace of evolution is almost unheard of in the fossil record, where the formation of a new species is typically thought to take millions of years. This rapid burst of innovation suggests that when the ecological slate is wiped clean, the survivors can diversify with a speed that borders on the biological impossible. Even more startling is research by Brian Huber of the Smithsonian Institution. Using temperature signals preserved in ancient shells and sophisticated climate models, his team suggested that new plankton species may have emerged within just decades of the impact. This human-scale timeline suggests that the recovery was not just a slow geological process, but a rapid biological response to the clearing skies. In this immediate post-impact disaster environment, the oceans were dominated by specific bloom taxa. Organisms like Thoracosphera operculata and Brarudufsphera bigelowii thrived in the chaotic, nutrient-unbalanced waters, acting as the first responders to the global crisis. The star of this rapid recovery was a tiny single-celled organism with a long name, Parvuloruguloglobigerina eugubina. This species of planktonic foraminifera is a critical marker for scientists because it does not exist before the impact. Its appearance in the fossil record marks the official dawn of the recovery. The helium-3 data revealed that this pioneer species evolved and spread across the world's oceans between 3,500 and 11,000 years after the catastrophe. It was followed by a burst of 10 to 20 other new species within just 6,000 years. These tiny creatures were the first to fill the empty ecological spaces left behind when 3/4 of all marine life vanished. One of the great mysteries of this era is why some organisms sprinted toward the future while others remained in disaster mode for millions of years. The answer likely lies in a survival strategy known as mixotrophy. The plankton that made it through the darkness were often mixotrophic coccolithophores. These are remarkable hybrid organisms capable of both photosynthesis and actively ingesting prey particles. In a world where the sun was blocked by the impact winter, a strictly photosynthetic organism was doomed. But a mixotroph could pivot. These organisms were capable of movement and the ingestion of prey, allowing them to hunt and consume the bacteria and organic debris that were abundant in the post-impact soup. These mixotrophic survivors acted as a biological bridge, keeping the marine food web from completely disintegrating until the skies cleared. The geography of the ocean also played a major role in who lived and who died. The extinction was far more severe in the tropical and temperate zones than it was near the poles. High-latitude communities in the southern hemisphere, in particular, seem to have weathered the crisis with much less loss of diversity. Scientists believe this might be because polar organisms were already adapted to long periods of darkness and extreme seasonal shifts. When the impact winter began, they were biologically pre-adapted for the cold and the dim light. In fact, while much of the ocean stalled, radiolaria actually saw high productivity in southern high latitudes, fueled by the cooling temperatures of the early Paleocene. Deep below the surface, the story was different again. The benthic foraminifera, those that live on or in the ocean floor, suffered far fewer extinctions than those living in the water column. As established in the previous chapter, these deep-sea systems rely on detritus, the rain of dead organic matter from above. When the surface ecosystems collapsed, the resulting mass of dead organisms provided a temporary feast for bottom dwellers. This abundance of food shielded them from the immediate effects of the impact winter, allowing them to survive the initial trauma. Eventually, as the marine microbiota recovered and the biological pump was restored, these deep-sea populations underwent their own stages of recovery and speciation. The result of this rapid evolution and regional migration was a marine world that looked fundamentally different from the one that had existed for the previous 80 million years. The previously mentioned extinction of the mosasaurs was driven by the collapse of their primary prey, the ammonites. The ammonites, in turn, had succumbed because their reproductive strategy involved releasing thousands of tiny plankton-like larvae into the surface waters. In the acidified and dark oceans of the early Paleocene, these larvae stood no chance, leading to the total extinction of a group that had dominated the seas for hundreds of millions of years. As the giants vanished, a new group of masters began to rise, the teleost fish. However, their ascent was not immediate. The earliest Cenozoic is characterized by a specific period called Patterson's Gap, a temporary decrease in the diversity of acanthomorph fish, a major group of teleosts, before their explosive radiation. Once they moved past this gap, they underwent a burst of innovation. Within the first few million years of the Cenozoic, groups like billfish, tunas, eels, and flatfish appeared for the first time, filling the niches left vacant by the monsters of the Mesozoic. This marine recovery demonstrates a profound truth about life's tenacity. Even when the environment is pushed to its absolute breaking point, the seeds of the modern world are already there, waiting for an opening. The oceans did not just heal, they reorganized. They transitioned from a world of shelled giants and reptilian predators to a more modern system defined by fast-moving fish and a highly resilient planktonic base. As the ocean stabilized and the microscopic world began to flourish, the focus of the recovery shifted back to the land, where the surviving mammals were about to undergo a transformation that was just as rapid and even more dramatic than that of the plankton. The oceans did not just heal, they reorganized. They transitioned from a world of shelled giants and reptilian predators to a more modern system defined by fast-moving fish and a highly resilient planktonic base. As the ocean stabilized and the microscopic world began to flourish, the focus of the recovery shifted back to the land, where the surviving mammals were about to undergo a transformation that was just as rapid and even more dramatic than that of the plankton. Chapter 3: The Great Mammalian Inflation. The popular image of mammals during the age of the dinosaurs is often one of tiny, insignificant shrews scurrying in the dark, barely eking out a living while the terrible lizards ruled the world. But the scientific record tells a far more nuanced and vibrant story. Mammals were not latecomers to the evolutionary stage. They had been thriving alongside the dinosaurs for over 160 million years. By the time the asteroid struck, they had already undergone their own evolutionary explosions, filling a variety of specialized roles. This rich history was brought to light in part by the pioneering work of Zofia Kiel-Jaworowska, who led the legendary Polish-Mongolian paleontological expeditions to the Gobi Desert. Her teams uncovered Mesozoic mammals that were far from simple, showing that our ancestors were already experimenting with diverse lifestyles long before the Cretaceous ended. There were Jurassic mammals like Castorocata, which possessed a scaly, flattened tail and was the ecological equivalent of a beaver. There was Velaticotherium, an ancient glider that resembled a modern flying squirrel, and Frutifossor, a creature with powerful limbs suited for tearing open termite nests, much like a tiny aardvark. Some, like the badger-sized Repenomamus, were even ambitious enough to prey on baby dinosaurs. However, the presence of large dinosaurs meant that mammals were effectively kept small by the sheer dominance of the reptiles. They were restricted to the margins, unable to evolve into the niches of large-bodied herbivores or apex predators. The catastrophic impact at the end of the Cretaceous acted as a violent filter, removing the reptilian ceiling that had suppressed mammalian growth for millions of years. The initial survivors were limited to small, rat-sized generalists. What followed was a period of recovery and expansion that happened with a speed that has left researchers stunned. For a long time, the details of this recovery were murky because fossils from the first million years of the Cenozoic are incredibly rare. Paleontologists often spent entire careers searching for a single mammal skull from this era, usually finding only isolated teeth or fragments of jawbones. That changed with a breakthrough at a site called Coral Bluffs in Colorado's Denver Basin. For a century, scientists had overlooked this area, believing previous expeditions had exhausted its potential. The landscape was littered with unassuming, egg-shaped rocks called concretions. These are hard orbs that form when minerals collect and solidify around an organic nucleus, such as a bone, acting like a geologic protective case. When researchers began cracking these concretions open, they discovered a smiling mammalian skull inside the very first one. Soon, they were finding complete skulls every 15 minutes. This cache of thousands of fossils has provided the most comprehensive catalog of mammalian recovery ever found, allowing us to track the growth of our ancestors with high-resolution precision. The timeline revealed by these fossils shows a series of dramatic growth spurts. Within just 100,000 years of the extinction event, mammalian diversity in the region had already doubled. More importantly, they were already getting bigger. The largest mammals at this stage, such as the genus Loxolophus, had reached the size of a well-fed raccoon, weighing roughly 13 to 20 pounds. This was a return to the maximum size mammals had achieved before the asteroid, but they reached it in what is, geologically speaking, the blink of an eye. By the 300,000-year mark, the growth continued to accelerate. The largest mammals had tripled in weight again, reaching about 45 pounds, roughly the size of a modern American beaver. This stage of recovery is exemplified by creatures like Carciopticus, a remote relative of today's hoofed mammals. Its anatomy tells a story of a world in transition, with teeth evolving to process tougher food sources. This success was not limited to the Denver Basin. In the Nacimiento Formation of New Mexico, researchers discovered Kimbatopsalis simmonsei, a beaver-like species that thrived during this same window. Kimbatopsalis was a multitubulate, a member of an ancient lineage of mammals that looked like rodents but were unrelated to them. Its presence in New Mexico provides a vital counterpart to the Colorado narrative, proving that the mammalian explosion was a widespread phenomenon across the recovering continent. By the 700,000-year mark, the mammalian body plan underwent another significant leap in size and complexity. Chapter 4: The Legume Revolution and the Green Engineering of Earth. To understand the world that emerged from the ash of the asteroid impact, we must look past the animals and focus on the green foundation that made their survival possible. While the animal kingdom struggled to find its footing, the plant world engaged in a massive, silent reorganization. For decades, the standard narrative suggested that flowering plants, or angiosperms, were minor players until the dinosaurs were gone. However, recent discoveries in the volcanic deposits of New Mexico have fundamentally upended this view. By examining what has been called a botanical Pompeii, researchers found that the engine of the modern world was actually built millions of years before the asteroid ever struck. Approximately 10 million years before the mass extinction, a massive ashfall from a volcanic eruption in what is now New Mexico buried a thriving ecosystem in a matter of days. This site, known as Dory's Tuff, revealed a forest already dominated by flowering plants. Unlike other Cretaceous sites where seeds were typically the size of poppy seeds and dispersed by the wind, this forest contained fruits the size of large blueberries. These were produced by large-trunked flowering trees, including relatives of the laurel and various types of palms. This 100-fold increase in fruit volume indicates that even before the dinosaurs vanished, plants were already investing massive resources into their seeds to attract animal dispersers. Crucially, this site confirms that the legume family, the beans and peas that would later fuel mammalian growth, was already present on the landscape 74.6 million years ago, though they remained a minor component of the forest understory. When the asteroid finally struck, it stripped the planet of half of its plant species. Following the brief 1,000-year reign of the fern spike, the recovery of the plant world became the essential prerequisite for the recovery of everything else. This recovery occurred in distinct, predictable waves. The landscape first transitioned into forests dominated by palms, hardy trees that could tolerate the unstable climate of the early Paleocene. For the survivors, these forests were the first reliable source of food in a world that had been a wasteland. Within about 100,000 years, as the climate experienced pulses of warmth driven by the ongoing volcanic greenhouse effect, the diversity of the flora began to climb. The next major shift occurred around 300,000 years after the impact, driven by the diversification of the walnut family. The appearance of these trees provided a much more concentrated source of energy than the palms. Walnuts and their relatives produced nutrient-dense nuts, which required specialized physical traits to consume. This botanical shift mirrors the appearance of mammals with large, flat, folded teeth, such as the genus Carciopticus. These animals were evolving specifically to exploit the new high-energy resources offered by the recovering forests. This was the beginning of a profound coevolutionary cycle. As plants evolved more nutritious seeds and fruits, including wild watermelons that were then only 5 centimeters, 2 inches wide, mammals evolved the dental machinery to eat them. However, the most transformative moment in the first million years of the Paleocene was the radiation of the legumes. While they had existed for millions of years in the shadow of the dinosaurs, it was only 700,000 years after the asteroid strike that the bean family underwent a massive expansion in North America. Legumes are biological superstars because they possess a unique ability to fix nitrogen from the atmosphere into the soil through a symbiotic relationship with bacteria in their roots. In a world where the soil had been depleted by global fires and erosion, the legumes acted as a natural fertilizer, enriching the earth and allowing for the growth of even denser, more complex forests. The seeds produced by these early legumes were the ultimate high-octane fuel for the animal kingdom. Packed with protein and fats, they provided nutrition that far exceeded that of ferns or palms. This legume revolution is perfectly synchronized with the most dramatic growth spurt in mammalian history. As protein-rich pods became a staple of the forest understory, mammals like Ectoconus and the giant Tyoniolabus appeared. These animals were essentially built out of the energy provided by legumes. Without this specific botanical innovation, the rapid inflation of mammalian body size might have taken millions of years longer. The disappearance of the dinosaurs didn't just change the food chain, it changed the very shape of the Earth's rivers. This transition is explained by the dinosaurs as ecosystem engineers hypothesis. During the Cretaceous, massive, multi-ton herbivores constantly trampled vegetation and uprooted trees, keeping forests open and patchy. Because vegetation was kept in check, riverbanks were weak. Without a dense root system to hold them together, rivers frequently jumped their channels, sending sediment flooding across the plains and creating the unstable, meandering river deposits seen in Cretaceous rock layers. Once the dinosaurs were gone, the mechanics keeping the forests open were removed. In their absence, flowering plants formed dense, closed canopy forests for the first time. These forests acted as a biological anchor for the planet's geography. The network of roots stabilized riverbanks, restricting them to broad, stable meander belts. Instead of frequent floods of sand, the floodplains became dominated by organic matter, leading to the formation of the massive coal swamps that define early Paleogene rock layers. In the Williston and Bighorn basins, the rocks change from unstable Cretaceous mudstones to stable, coal-bearing Paleocene layers, reflecting a world where plants had finally taken control of the terrain. This stabilization allowed for the development of the world's first true tropical rainforests. Within 2 million years of the impact, the Denver Basin was home to a sweltering, high-diversity rainforest with a complex multi-layered structure. This complexity created a vast array of new ecological niches. One of the most subtle changes during this time was the evolution of seed dispersal. In the dinosaur-dominated world, many plants relied on the wind, which is why Cretaceous seeds were so small. But in a dense, closed canopy forest, there is very little wind. This pressure drove the evolution of heavier, flightless seeds. The vegetation literally traded its wings for hooks and flesh, evolving to cling to the fur of mammals or be swallowed and deposited elsewhere. The leaf fossils from this era also reveal a hidden struggle between plants and insects. In the Cretaceous, the record shows a rich diversity of insect-feeding damage, suggesting high predation. But in the first million years after the impact, that damage almost entirely disappears. Even though plants were rebounding, the insect communities had been devastated. This period is defined by the Lilliput effect, where the surviving insects were significantly smaller than their ancestors. Evidence of this is found in the Noctidemesis bony burrows, tiny traces left by soil-dwelling insects that were dwarfed by the species that came before and after. For over 1 million years, the forests of the Paleocene were a predator-free paradise for plants, allowing them to devote all their energy to growth and reproduction rather than defense. By the end of the first 1 million years, the botanical engine had completely reorganized the surface of the Earth. The landscape was no longer a series of open floodplains, but a dense, stable network of forests and complex river systems. The plants had not just filled the void left by the dinosaurs, they had created a more energy-dense and stable environment. As the forests reached their full complexity and the legumes provided a steady supply of fuel, the stage was set for the emergence of the most sophisticated survivors of the apocalypse. While the mammals were claiming the ground and the forests were stabilizing the land, the only surviving branch of the dinosaur lineage was undergoing its own radical transformation in the skies. Chapter 5: The Ghost Lineages and the Canopy Pioneers. The geological record is often described as a tape recorder of Earth's history, but it is a recorder that frequently skips, overlaps, and sometimes creates ghost signals that challenge our understanding of the past. Nowhere is this more evident than in the debate surrounding the finality of the dinosaur extinction. While the scientific consensus is that the non-avian dinosaurs were erased by the Chicxulub impact, a persistent and controversial body of evidence suggests that the story might not have ended quite so abruptly for every lineage. In certain pockets of the world, specifically in the San Juan Basin of New Mexico and parts of the Colorado Plateau, researchers have uncovered fossilized bones of hadrosaurs, ankylosaurs, and even tyrannosaurs in rock layers that appear to sit above the iridium-rich clay of the extinction boundary. This has sparked one of the most intense debates in modern paleontology, linked specifically to the work of researcher James Fassett. In 2009, Fassett identified bones from these iconic groups within the Ojo Alamo sandstone, a formation traditionally dated to the early Paleocene. If these fossils truly belong to animals that lived after the impact, it would mean that small populations of dinosaurs survived into the new era, perhaps for as long as 500,000 years. Proponents of this theory suggest a Canada refugia model to explain these finds. In this scenario, certain dinosaur populations in high-latitude regions like Canada may have been shielded from the most immediate and lethal thermal effects of the impact. As the global climate shifted and temperatures dropped during the impact winter, these survivors may have migrated south toward New Mexico and Colorado, seeking more temperate microclimates. In this version of history, the giants did not vanish in a single day, but underwent a protracted grind of dwindling populations, eking out a living in a world that was no longer built for them. However, many other scientists view these Paleocene dinosaurs with deep skepticism, attributing their presence in younger rocks to a process known as reworking. In this more widely accepted view, these are zombie fossils, bones that were originally buried in Cretaceous sediment but were later unearthed by ancient rivers and redeposited into younger Paleocene layers. The debate highlights the extreme difficulty of reading a timeline where a few meters of rock can represent hundreds of thousands of years, and where the violence of the Earth's own geological processes can shuffle the deck of history. While the survival of the giant, non-avian dinosaurs remains a subject of fierce contention, the survival of their avian descendants is a proven fact that changed the trajectory of the planet. Birds are, in the most literal sense, living dinosaurs, and their journey through the first 1 million years of the Cenozoic is a masterclass in evolutionary resilience. Before the asteroid hit, the skies were filled with a staggering variety of birds, many of which still possessed the teeth and long bony tails of their raptor ancestors. But the extinction was a brutal filter for the avian line. The selectivity of this extinction remains a point of active scholarly debate. Some fossil evidence has suggested that ground-dwelling birds suffered significantly, yet the most recent consensus, bolstered by the discovery of the wonder chicken, or Asteriornis, suggests that the collapse of the world's forests was the deciding factor. When global fires and the subsequent impact winter incinerated the high canopy forests, the tree-dwelling birds lost their habitats and primary food sources almost instantly. This favored small, ground-dwelling or water-dwelling species that were not dependent on the forest canopy. These survivors possessed a very specific biological advantage, the combination of strong beaks and gizzards. While many of their cousins relied on specialized diets of insects or fish, resources that collapsed during the impact winter, the ancestors of modern birds likely survived because they could eat seeds. Seeds are biological time capsules, packed with energy and capable of lasting for years in the soil. Birds with toothless beaks and powerful muscular gizzards were uniquely equipped to crack open and grind these hardy survival rations when the rest of the food chain had disintegrated. Asteriornis, which lived less than 1 million years after the impact, represents the oldest known member of the lineage that would eventually give rise to modern chickens and ducks. Its presence so soon after the apocalypse shows that the seeds of modern bird diversity were already beginning to sprout in the ruins of the dinosaur world. As these avian survivors began their rapid radiation, exploring a world suddenly devoid of their pterosaur competitors, another group of survivors was beginning a journey that would eventually lead to us. In the same Montana Badlands where the last T-Rex skeletons are found, the fossil record of the first 1,000,000 years reveals the presence of a tiny, furry creature that would become the foundation of the primate lineage. This was Purgatorius. For a long time, Purgatorius was known only from isolated teeth, which are so small they can easily be mistaken for bits of gravel. However, recent analysis of the Hell Creek collections has identified a specific new species, Purgatorius mckeeveri, named in honor of Frank McKeever and his family, who supported the research. The timeline for this creature's emergence is incredibly precise. Evidence suggests these early primates were active between 105,000 and 139,000 years after the asteroid impact. Purgatorius was a member of the Plecidaptiforms, a group of archaic primate-like mammals. It was a creature of the trees, a tiny arboreal pioneer that emerged into the sunlight just as the first post-impact forests were beginning to stabilize. While the larger mammals of the early Paleocene were busy inflating their body sizes to claim the forest floor, Purgatorius and its kin went up. They took to the recovering forest canopy, a three-dimensional world that was being rapidly reorganized by the rise of fruit-bearing trees. This allowed them to exploit the energy-rich forests established during the Botanical Revolution that saw plants producing larger, fleshier fruits to attract animal dispersers. The rise of these early primates was explosive. Within the first 1,000,000 years of the Paleocene, in regions like the Hell Creek area of Montana, these archaic primates began to outstrip their competitors in sheer abundance. Specifically, they moved past the archaic ungulates, the ancestors of today's hoofed mammals, to dominate the ecological niche of small-bodied, tree-dwelling omnivores. This was a critical turning point. While other mammal groups were prioritizing brawn over brains to navigate the competitive and dangerous forest floor, the ancestors of primates were developing the specialized limb structures and sensory adaptations needed for life in the canopy. Their ankles were flexible, allowing them to navigate complex branches, and their teeth were becoming increasingly specialized for a high-energy diet of both insects and the newly evolving fruits. The maturity and diversity of these fossils found so soon after the impact provide a vital clue to the timing of primate origins, suggesting the lineage originated as shadow dwellers alongside the dinosaurs of the late Cretaceous. By the end of the first 1,000,000 years, the Earth had undergone a total reorganization. The age of reptiles had been replaced by a transitional world where the survivors were testing the limits of their new reality. The first million years were not just a period of recovery. They were the crucible in which the modern world was forged, a testament to the fact that life does not just endure catastrophe, it uses the ruins of the old world to build something entirely new. As the brawny pioneers of the forest floor and the nimble ancestors in the trees continued to diversify, the planet moved toward a new equilibrium. The question that remained was no longer whether life would survive, but which of these competing strategies, the massive size of the new herbivores or the specialized intelligence of the canopy dwellers, would ultimately define the future of the Cenozoic. The first million years after the asteroid were not merely a period of survival, but a masterclass in planetary resilience. We have tracked Earth's transition from a scorched wasteland of ferns to a lush world of nitrogen-fixing legumes and dense rainforests. In the oceans, microscopic pioneers rebuilt the food web, while on land, mammals and birds seized the void left by giants to grow